Excellent. Okay, so hi everyone. I'm Jess Hyman, and I'm with the Housing Advocacy Programs at CVOEO, which is the Champlain Valley Office of Economic Opportunity, and I focus on fair housing work. And I'm also the Vice Chair of the Vermont Affordable Housing Steering Committee. And so I'm here in the Vermont Affordable Housing Coalition capacity today. Um, so before we get started, I would love to just know a little bit more about who's in the room today. Um, oh, super. Oh, thank you, Stephanie. uh, and so if I could just get from a show of hands, I'm just curious about the geographic diversity of our group today. So if you're from the southern part of the state, could you just physically raise your hand? I can see pretty much everyone's faces. Excellent. Hi, Sarah, April, Robin, Tammy, Rose. Wonderful. And who's here from the more central part of the state? Alicia, Cassandra, Sue. Great. Wonderful. Good. And then who's from the more northern part of the state? Sandra, Stephanie, Jay, Jessica, too. Wonderful. Good. Good. Yeah, great geographic representation. And then, so today we're talking about housing and homelessness. And I'm wondering how many, and I think I know the answer to this question already, but I'm wondering how many of you are working with families who are facing challenges or struggles related to housing? Lots of hands going up. Yep. No surprises there. Great. Well, first off, I wanted to thank you all for all the work that you're doing to support kids and families all around the state. It's incredible work and so necessary and so needed. And also for being here today to raise your voices, to speak up for kids and their families, and make sure that our our state is responsive to their needs. So for this workshop today, I'm going to go over some basic information about basic information and data about housing and homelessness in the state, what's going on in the legislature, um, the Affordable Housing Committee's priorities, and then some tips for your day today, and some advocacy requests. And we'll also have lots of time for questions. So if you have any, we'll do our Q&A at the end, but also feel free to pipe in during the presentation if you have questions. I think the presentation will be probably about 20 to 30 minutes tops, leaving plenty of time for chat afterwards. But feel free to put questions in the chat or any thoughts that come up along the way. And then at the end, at the end, we'll do our Q&A session, and then I'll have some extra resources to share. Sound good for folks? Excellent. Great. So I'm going to share my screen and we'll go through a few slides. It'll just take a moment for me to pull this up. Okay. Can everyone see the main slide? Great. And then also, if Stephanie, since I can only see a few of the faces when I'm doing the screen sharing, so if you see a hand up, please jump in and interrupt me.
I will absolutely do that. You got
Wonderful.
it.
Thank you. So, thinking as we think about housing and homelessness, we know that housing has a huge effect on every aspect of our lives. We all know this, and this has really been reinforced over the past year plus of the COVID pandemic. Where we live determines where our kids go to school, ease of getting to work, to healthcare, to recreation, to childcare. What kind of physical danger we might be exposed to, our physical environment. And it's also connected to our health and economic stability. And this is especially important in a tight housing market, and that housing that's affordable for folks to rent or own or have access to is so critical for so many pieces of our lives. And as we know, housing is a key social determinant for health. And safe, stable, and affordable housing is essential to our children's well-being and success. And then housing instability and homelessness and unsafe conditions really contribute to childhood trauma, adverse childhood experiences, and then negative outcomes. So by making housing more available to everyone, and especially housing that's affordable, is good for our families, it's good for our communities, and it's good for our state. And to do that, we need to make investments. We need to make investments at a local level, at a state level, and at a national level to ensure that everyone has access to safe, stable, and affordable homes. Because as we, if we learn nothing else from COVID, we learned that housing really is healthcare. So let's talk a little bit about what I mean by affordable housing. So housing is considered affordable if the cost doesn't exceed 30% of a household's monthly income. And that affordability is relative. It's determined by housing cost and the ability, of course, of all of us to pay for that cost. For renters, when we talk about cost, it's generally rent and utilities. And for homeowners, that's expanded to include mortgage, taxes, and insurance, and condo fees or other things like that, if applicable. And we know that rents and home prices are rising faster than our ability to pay. And a large portion of our state has low wage jobs, and that makes it really challenging to make ends meet. So, what are we looking at in Vermont in terms of the housing stock? Um, so, Nearly 60% of the homes in Vermont are owned, and about a quarter are rented. And then another, roughly 17% are seasonal homes, recreational homes, vacation homes. And we know that there just aren't, whoops, I'm just realizing that. Have you been seeing the slides advance? Oh my gosh. Well, I'll just go through them a little. Sorry about that. That's the challenge of having multiple screens open. And you'd think after a year of COVID that we would all have our online Zoom presentations down like that, but there are always glitches. Reminds us we're human. Okay, so we talked about affordable housing. We talked about the housing stock in Vermont. Now let's talk about some of the challenges. So, keep in mind that all the numbers and data that you're seeing in this presentation are primarily pre-COVID data. There's some things that have been updated in the past months, but a lot of the standard data from the American Community Survey, from the census, and the state housing needs assessment, and some other sources were compiled pre-COVID. So there have been some changes, but this still will give you a general idea. So here in Vermont, a lot of people are cost burdened. And what cost burdened means is paying more than we can afford for our housing. So about half of the state's renters are paying more than 30% of their income for housing. And half of those, again, uh, pay 50% or more. And that's huge. That just doesn't leave enough money for food, for healthcare, for childcare, for all the basic necessities that we need to have safe and stable lives. Similarly, for owners, for people who own their own homes, the rate is a little lower, but still nearly a third of Vermonters who own their homes are paying more than 30% of their income for housing. And it's a tight market. Our vacancy rate in the state is very low, seventh lowest in the country. On average around the state, vacancy rate is 3.4%. And that varies widely between 1.9% in Chittenden and 5.9% in Orleans. And 4 to 6% is considered a healthy market. So it's really hard, and that affects household mobility. So when the vacancy rate is so low, it's harder for people to get out of challenging, not only harder for people to find new homes, but it's hard for people to move from home to home. And when people don't have housing mobility, it reduces their housing choice. And when our housing choice is reduced, then we're subject to all sorts of other constraints. And also in Vermont, we have a really old housing stock. So Nearly a third of our homes were built before 1939, and that means we have a lot of lead paint. There are a lot of energy efficiency issues and safety issues. So the homes that are out there aren't aren't all in a good condition for people to be living in. Um, and then there's homelessness. So we have thousands of people, estimated about 2,500 people right now in the state, including nearly 400 children who don't have stable homes. And this has changed that how the state is is serving people who are experiencing homelessness has really changed over the past year, with the pandemic. With some amazing state programs and fantastic state efforts, to provide more motel and hotel housing for folks who are experiencing homelessness and their families has made an incredible difference of putting roofs over people's heads. But this is temporary. The influx of money and support that's coming to the state for homelessness assistance and rental assistance is fantastic, but it's not necessarily a long-term solution. And so the ongoing issue of homelessness is something that we really have to be thinking about, and thinking about longer term solutions, and how we pair housing supports with services as well. And so I also want to point out there's a video link at the bottom of the slide, and I will be sharing, making these slides available. So so no need to furiously take note of statistics and things. We will have this posted. And I want to point out there's a link to a video that was made during Homeless Awareness Day at the legislature, which was last month. A fantastic video telling the story of homelessness in the state, and hearing from people with lived experience and service providers and housers as well. So I'd like to point people's attention to that. So, obviously very closely connected to housing availability is income. And there are a growing number of people in Vermont who are struggling. So, looking at this chart, we can see how the number of low-income households has been steadily increasing over the years. And we're looking at, a large percentage of our population that's struggling to make ends meet. And this is, of course, connected to how we afford housing. So the National Low Income Housing Coalition every year does some research on housing affordability. It's called the Out of Reach Report. And what they do is they look at all around the country to see what it takes to afford housing that's deemed modest or affordable, and how much people need to earn to be able to afford that housing. And so for Vermont, they calculated an average housing wage of $23.36 an hour, which is about a little more than $48,000 a year. And so that's what it takes to afford a modest 2-bedroom apartment. And of course, that varies around the state. So in the Burlington, South Burlington metropolitan area, that rate is $30.25 is what it takes to afford a 2-bedroom apartment. So, thinking about our minimum wage, which is now just increased, but still just $11.75, that means that if you have two full-time employed wage earners earning minimum wage or even a bit more, it doesn't add up to being able to afford a basic 2-bedroom apartment. And I wanted, there's a little asterisk on this. The National Low Income Housing Coalition puts a modest 2-bedroom apartment in Vermont at costing $1,215 a month. I would challenge them to find a 2-bedroom apartment in a lot of the state for that price. I think that in many parts of our state, it's much higher than that. And of course, more than half of Vermont's workforce is earning wages below that 23.36 an hour. And so to exacerbate the challenges of finding housing that's affordable, there is there just isn't enough housing out there of all types. So the most recent estimate is that we would need 11,688 more homes in the state to fully meet the need of our whole population. And that's a lot. And for every 100 um, low income renter household in the state, we only have 42 affordable apartments available. So there's a huge gap there, and this has a lot of implications in our communities, in our families, in our communities, because with all the efforts. So when you think of all the efforts now to support people who are experiencing homelessness and to help people transition into stable and sustainable housing, and all uh, the federal and state support that's going to those efforts. Um, and there, if if there's no place for people to move into, then all the financial support in the world isn't going to make a difference because there just simply aren't enough available homes on the rental side. And on the homeownership side, we're seeing obviously home prices going up. And so this number here, the median price single family home being at about 255,000 around the state, um, is that number is probably is a bit higher now too, but very challenging to afford affordable homes here. And it's clear that the numbers just don't add up for so many people. And so when we talk about housing, it's important to think about a lot of the folks in the housing world talk about the three-legged stool. And the three-legged stool is made up of three pieces. There's supply, and that's housing production. So how many homes are out there? How many are available? How do we get more? And then and the second leg of the stool is subsidies. So how do we support people in being able to afford what's out there? And these subsidies are individual subsidies, and we'll talk a little bit more about the different types in Vermont. And then also things like housing trust funds, land donations, ways to increase the affordability of building housing as well. And then the third leg of the stool is stability and services. So we know that stability is important in housing, and we also know that services are essential to helping people retain their housing and be able to be sustainable in their housing.
I want to note that Jessica mentioned in the chat, in a very informal survey of availability of affordable renters right now, we found 0 in some counties, Lamoille, and almost none in some others, Chittenden and Franklin.
Exactly. Yeah, Jessica, thank you so much for bringing that up, and thank you, Stephanie, for reading the chat because I can't see it. That's perfect. Yeah, and that's something that we're seeing. So just to give you an example, through CVOEO, we're administering like the CARES um, rental housing voucher program, and there are almost 400 vouchers available. And so nearly 400 people have been approved for these vouchers, and no more than 2/3 of them have been able to find housing. And so here are, there's 100 people who have financial support to have almost a year of housing subsidized, and those homes just aren't out there. So how does housing get built? Well, here in Vermont, we've got an amazing network of community-based nonprofit organizations. Development organizations. There's also Evernorth, which is formerly Housing Vermont, um, and they're a regional nonprofit, and they partner with local organizations as well. We have public housing authorities, both state and local, and then of course we have for-profit developers. But I think it's really important to note that the primary source of funding for new housing production is the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board. And we'll be talking more about VHCB when we talk about legislative priorities. And so, and I'm sure that folks are familiar with the regional nonprofit housing development organizations in your area, but I just wanted to list them here. So if it's not something you're aware of, you can take a look. So we have them all over the state, and these organizations do incredible work. They're not only supplying housing, but a lot of them have really important services that go along with those, and they've been really ramping up their availability and services over the past year as well. And when we talk about housing creation, we also need to talk about permanent affordability, because it's one thing to create affordable housing now, but if it's housing that's only affordable for a short amount of time, then it doesn't have ongoing long-term benefits. So when we talk about permanent affordability, we mean housing that's obviously that will always be affordable for low to moderate income Vermonters. And this is really a priority for our state's funders and nonprofit housing developers. And so these policies preserve public subsidies and ensure that there'll be affordable housing in perpetuity. And the other thing that's really important to consider is fair housing and housing choice. So fair housing is the right to equal opportunity in housing choice and the right to buy, rent, or live in a dwelling free from discrimination. And it's important to note that, despite federal and state protections based on many protected classes, race, color, national origin, religion, sex, family status, disability, age, gender identity, sexual orientation, marital status, receipt of public assistance, and Vermont's newest protected class is being a victim of abuse, sexual assault, or stalking. So despite all these protections that are enshrined both in federal and state law, Vermonters still face discrimination and harassment. And this is really exacerbated by the tight housing market, by COVID, by systemic racism, and a lot of other factors. And so the segregation and pervasive discrimination in housing really contributes to all sorts of other inequities in our communities, even here in Vermont. And this can contribute to homelessness, neighborhood disinvestment, and disparities in home ownership and accumulation of personal wealth. And so this is a really important piece of this bigger housing picture. So we'll go back to another leg of the stool here, rent subsidies. The rental subsidies generally ensure that tenants won't pay more than 30% of their income for rent. And here in Vermont, we have a number of options available, Section 8, USDA Rural Development, subsidies through HUD, Vermont Rental Subsidy, and other rental assistance programs. And then there are also a whole new set of supports through COVID funding as well. But it's important to note that, despite these subsidies that are available, they aren't easily accessible to folks. There are long waiting lists for a lot of them, and more than half of low-income households simply don't have rental assistance at all. And then in terms of homeless assistance, so Vermont has an amazing network of homeless assistance groups and organizations and programs, plus a lot of new supports that have come through COVID-related funding. And I'm not going to go through all of these, but I think one of the reasons that I like this big, messy slide full of all this list is it really shows how complicated Vermont's response to homelessness is and how many players there are, and there are so many different pieces of addressing the needs of people who are experiencing homelessness, and especially families experiencing homelessness, that Vermont is addressing this in a lot of different ways. And the main focuses are, first on outreach, on connecting with people, assessing people's needs, working on prevention and diversion. There's emergency shelter that's provided at different stages in the process. Focus on transitional housing, and then rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing. These are all pieces of the puzzle, uh, and and especially important is Vermont's focus on case management. And supportive services throughout the process, and also on prevention. So, ways that we can help people who are, and this is one of the most important things is we want to make sure that if people do experience homelessness, that it's as brief as possible and not repeated. And one of the ways to do that is to, and in fact the best way to do this is to make sure that nobody ends up homeless in the first place. And so a lot of the programs are really geared towards housing stability, and housing education, financial capability, and other supports, ways that we can really support our community to make sure that we all have the information and the resources, the skills, the encouragement, and the confidence to be safe and stable in our housing. So let's see. Okay, we're doing well for time. This is great. So let's talk about affordable housing funding priorities. So the Vermont Affordable Housing Coalition is a membership organization, represents about 90 different organizations and entities around the state, and one of the biggest roles of the coalition is advocacy. And so these are, I wanted to share some of our affordable housing funding priorities for this year, and then we can talk a little bit about some of the things to focus on today. Um, so first off, you know, full funding for the for VHCB. We're looking for full statutory funding, and then also additional investments in affordable housing. And so the governor's budget has this in place now. We are really pleased to see the proposals for a high level of funding for VHCB. And the governor's budget request totals, let's see, 3.4 million for VHCB, which includes 20 million in one-time investments, at 10.8 from the property transfer tax, and 4 million from the capital bill. So this is huge. These critical investments will help many of our homeless Vermonters who are currently sheltering in motels, help them transition to permanent housing. This will help making further headway into our chronic affordable housing shortage. It would reduce the backlog of home access for modifications for people with disabilities. It would allow for investments in critical mobile home infrastructure, and there's some water quality improvements and some rural economy improvements as well. So all of those things would come from VHCB funding. And every year, this one of our highest priorities is full statutory funding for VHCB. Another one of our big priorities this year is rental housing safety. So there's been a lot of work over the past years on the rental housing safety bill, and the Rental Housing Advisory Board has been working really hard to make recommendations that include a rental registry, a Vermont Housing Incentive Program to do housing rehab for rental properties, and there's an error in there. The prioritization of BIPOC home ownership should be in a separate area. But the rental housing safety bill is one of our biggest priorities, and that there's some worry about that this week, where it was supposed to be brought up today, and there's a possibility that might get bumped. So we really want to see the rental housing safety bill moved forward before crossover, so that we can continue. Another priority is the General Assistance Emergency Housing program. So there's been a plan afoot to change how that funding is allocated and how the emergency housing program is managed, to shift it from state management to community management, and we're advocating for a delay in that restructuring. Um, we'd also like to see more funding for mobile home parks. So, mobile home communities are a really key piece of the affordable housing puzzle. And here we have communities all over the state where there's a low barriers to home ownership because mobile homes are more affordable than other types of homes, and the 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 state's mobile home communities are facing a lot of infrastructure challenges, and so we would like to see more funding going towards capital funding needs and also Vermont housing tax credit program increase. Weatherization is another priority, more assistance for low income households and also municipal buildings as well. And then, of course, the emergency back rent assistance, landlord mediation, and money to move programs, all COVID related programs. Um, Also, the Vermont rental subsidy and the Subsidy plus care program. So these support folks experiencing homelessness and also reach up families. And then the broader homeless assistance. So the Housing First, the Housing Opportunity Program, state rental assistance, and family supportive housing. So all of these things address those three legs of the stool that I talked about earlier. They support more housing production, they support more stability and subsidies for Vermont households, and excuse me, excuse me, and also help increase the supply of housing. And our other priorities, we would like to see Vermont 211 fully funded because that's a really necessary support for folks in emergency situations. We want more funding for Reach Up and a whole slew of other things. We would change the world if we could. These are our highest level priorities. So, how can you all get involved on this very special legislative day? So these are some of the key messages related to housing that would be most valuable in supporting this work and making positive change for all Vermonters and especially the families who you're working with. First off, and of course, we always want to be thanking our legislators for the work they're doing. We don't always get all the changes that we want to see, and these folks are working really hard to do their best to serve their communities in the state. So we want to thank them for the smart decisions they've made and the timely investments they've made to help alleviate homelessness during the pandemic. And to support the development of permanently affordable housing. The more that our legislators can hear that message, the better. We also want to thank the specifically the members of the House Committees on Human Services and Housing for supporting the delay of the General Assistance Housing Program restructuring. We need more time to make sure that a new system is sustainable and is really going to work for the communities, for the people we're serving. And we want to urge the House Appropriations Committee to support this delay as well. We also want to urge members of the Senate Committee on it's Economic Development, Housing, and General Affairs to pass the Rental Housing Advisory Board recommendations. And that would need to be passed by March 12th, which is the end of this week, to meet the crossover deadline. And so these are the highest priority messages to folks. And we can talk during the Q&A, we can talk more about each of these. So before I stop the slideshow portion, I wanted to share some general resources with you. So really, as you're thinking about and talking about housing in your communities and your local housing needs, there are some really good data sources. The Vermont Housing Finance Agency has a website called housingdata.org, which is a great resource that allows you to look at income and housing and community data at a town level, county level, and state level. So if you're a data geek, check it out. There's lots of cool graphs. You can filter and fine tune to get information you need. Also, I wanted to point you to the Vermont Department of Housing and Community Development's Housing Needs Assessment, which is just released last year. A lot of really good data. And if you go to that main page, there are some fact sheets that give really nice, very easily digestible snapshots of housing issues in our communities. Also, especially now, as more COVID-related funding is coming into the state and more support programs are available, I want to point you to the Vermont Legal Aid's um, um, Vermont Legal Aid keeps really good track of legal updates and housing supports on their website too. And that's, let's see, in here in the housing benefits and legal updates link. And then of course the Vermont Housing Coalition, the Vermont Coalition to End Homelessness, and a slew of other organizations that I didn't have room for on the slide, all really good resources. And then when we share the slide, I wanted to point you out to two more resources. We've got some fair housing related information and housing resources data at the bottom, and then the expanded legislative priorities sheet that's expanded from what's available on the HUVA site for the ECDL day that's at the bottom here. So contact info if you want to learn more about the CVOEO's statewide housing advocacy programs and our statewide services and resources and education programs and hotlines for tenants, for mobile home residents. If you want to learn more about fair housing, about the housing voucher program or our housing navigation services, please reach out to us at CVOEO. And we also encourage you to join the Vermont Affordable Housing Coalition. The monthly meeting is actually going on right now, but the next one will be coming up next month. It's a fantastic way to learn more about state and federal housing policy, to hear what's going on at the legislature and hear what's going on in the communities, and to learn more about housing related resources. So that's coming up every month. So I will end my screen share here and actually see your faces, which is way more exciting than looking at the screen. And I'd love to open up the conversation and see what comments and questions you have, or if there's anything you want to share about some of the housing challenges that that folks you're working with are facing. We can chat a little more.
You want me to say something? Yeah, go. Can I share something, Jess? Is that okay?
Oh, please do. Please do. I'm just getting the screen up where I can see people's faces. Yes.
Okay. So hi, everybody. My name is Jessica Radford. For those of you that don't know me, I work at Vermont Legal Aid. And Jess mentioned the Emergency Housing Initiative that's been proposed by the administration. So that proposal would eliminate the General Assistance Motel Voucher Program that's been keeping everybody experiencing homelessness safely, non-congregately sheltered with a roof over their head during the pandemic. And the administration's idea was to have the state not play that role in providing that shelter service, and instead to just give more money to local communities to, manage their shelters and put people in motels as, they saw fit. One of the things that we argue strongly is that government actually has a role to play in provision of shelter and in preventing homelessness. And so it's really hard stuff to do, right? But the idea of the state sort of washing their hands of it and just farming it out to the local communities to figure out is something that we really opposed. And the good news is that in the legislature, it largely appears that that idea is dead in the water. For instance, in House Appropriations, the chair is saying she didn't want to hear about it anymore. She didn't want to hear any testimony, and she wanted folks to just go away and figure out some plan B. But now the big question is, what's plan B? It can't just be going back to the same old, where the rules unfairly distinguish between a family with an 8-year-old kid and a family with a 5-year-old kid, and where a family might only get 28 days of shelter and then literally be left with nothing when we know that only 3% of people experiencing homelessness are able to actually secure permanent housing within a 28-day period, right? I'm not ready to see people living in tents and cars, even after the pandemic is over. And so I've been trying to figure out what's a good plan B. Recently, the Affordable Housing Coalition and a number of other service providers signed on to a letter, just pitching some other ideas. But I think this is a time to tell legislators that, not only are we not okay with the state relinquishing its responsibility to look out for people experiencing homelessness, but we have so much federal money coming into the state. This is our opportunity to come up with something big and creative and different so it can really make a dent in homelessness and meeting people's needs for shelter. That's it. So it's still a work in progress, but boy, coming up with that plan B is hard.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Yeah. And we have this amazing opportunity, and we need to seize it.
I don't know what a plan B should be, but I do feel like housing and homelessness is such a, it is, to me anyway, it is sort of the building block of all the other challenges. If you don't have a safe place to live, especially if you're a family with young children, how could you possibly do any of the other things that you need to do? And it's such a big expense. It seems to me that so many of the solutions that get talked about are sort of short-term band-aid, sort of it's such an urgent problem when it's a problem that we just want to fix it in that moment. And really the solutions are bigger and longer term. And when you were saying that we have this opportunity, I think we have this we have this gift of, we have the Band-Aid in place right at this exact moment. Can we figure out something that could be more sustained? I don't know.
And in the Reach Up Coalition, there's a Reach Up session later, right? One of the things we're advocating for, Reach Up families are getting $625 a month for a family of two, $744 a month for a family. Of course you can't afford a place to live, right? These are kids, we're talking about with no roof over their head. How do they focus on school? How do they stay healthy? So we're advocating for every Reach Up family to get some of this emergency rental assistance that's coming through, which I'm hoping, and the Biden administration has said, that all of this money that's coming in is just a down payment on trying to resolve some of these housing and homelessness issues, right? So let's do everything we can right now for the people who need the help the most, and especially for the people experiencing homelessness, not throw them out on the street in the meantime. And for the Reach Up families, another group that I'm advocating really hard for, we know that there's almost nothing that we can do when we get their eviction case, because of course they can't afford their rent. So let's give everybody a subsidy as a bridge to what I'm hoping with the new administration is going to be, some big stuff coming up in the very near future.
I don't want to take up too much airtime, but I like the idea of a bridge, and just I spend most of my time thinking about access to childcare. And so I feel like sort of similarly, if you could give people a bridge for sort of all those big critical needs in that moment, and just hold them there for, a couple of months or whatever that time period is, so that then, I don't know, so that longer term things could be in place. It seems like that would be an amazing accomplishment. In terms of giving people access to these big life-changing, big ticket things that are systemically lacking right now.
Totally agreed. Yes, and Angela, yes, we need more Section 8 vouchers. What did Stephanie said? Yes, the literal housing is the foundation of our communities. And so, and along with this too, is the availability of housing. We just simply need more housing built, and it needs to be in the places in our communities where people want and need housing, and it has to be where people can access public transportation, and it has to be done smartly. Robin, I see your hand up.
What I'm concerned about is that maybe at the point we do have housing and enough housing, how do we ensure that the families have the skills to maintain that housing? And that to me is, if we don't do some of that, I'm going to call it aftercare. It's probably not the right term to use, but unless we support them for a period of time, they're not going to be successful because they don't have those skills.
Exactly. And there are two
I hope
parts.
that doesn't sound like I am patronizing people, because I'm not.
Yeah. No, Robin, you're totally right. And there are two parts of that too, because they're supporting people when they're transitioning into housing, and making sure that they have their needs met and they have their supports. And there's also the education and support that we can do early on. Why don't we have programs in our high schools and in colleges that help people learn basic household budgeting, understanding rental law, some of these basic community skill building things that can really be helpful to people throughout their whole lives. And I think that's really important as well. Just to put in a little plug, CVOEO has a rent right program, and it's an educational program that combines basic rental skills and information with financial capability training, and it's a really fantastic program that helps people build not just those skills for sustaining housing, but also helps build confidence and connections with each other and in their community, and that can really support longer term success as well. What other thoughts and questions do folks have?
I just had a thought of one to continue on what Robin's thought was. I think too that it's an excellent point. And early childhood care helps sometimes bridge that gap. I'm a family support worker, so working with families and getting them those skills while they know that their child is in that great environment for education and learning, I think does make a good gap or helps bridge that gap. And then my other thought, when it comes to housing, talking about creative solutions, I'd love to see. I live in Southern Vermont. Unfortunately, with everything going on, we have a lot of empty buildings. It'd be great to have those buildings, rehabbed and, have something done with them rather than have them sit there empty. Or even having like a community apartments where you have maybe an office that has those support services housed within the apartment building. And that way we're kind of, at the same time we're building our economy, we're also helping the people in our economy to keep growing.
Absolutely, that's all right on. And the having support services located where people live makes a huge difference. So the SASH model, we would love to see more family SASH programs around the state. And then in terms of the repurposing unused housing, that's expensive, and it's also doable. And that's where the VHCB funding comes in too, in a lot of that rehab. Also, as we come out of COVID, I think we'll probably see a big shift in how people are using commercial space, and there could be a really good opportunity to transition commercial space to residential space in really creative ways. In the chat, so Alicia has pointed out that most early educators make way less than the $23 housing wage an hour. So that's another thing we can be doing, is increasing the minimum wage. If we can bring up the minimum wage, making sure that wages are commensurate with the needs of the community, then that helps bridge that affordability gap as well. Let's see, what else? What other ideas do you have, or what would you like to see happen in your communities?
I can tell you a little bit more about my crazy idea for Plan B.
Oh, yeah.
So we're about to get $152 million in Vermont for the American Rescue Plan. We already got $200 million for emergency rental assistance, from the bill that passed in December. And there's an opportunity in that American Rescue Plan. So there's going to be something like $12 million for permanent affordable housing and other, housing related things. My thing is, I don't want to build more shelters. Yes, I think we need to provide shelter for people experience, put that all into permanent affordable housing, right? And then with the 152 million for emergency rental assistance, if you don't spend all of it, come October 1, 2022, you can use 25% of that also for permanent affordable housing. So that's 38 million, right? Imagine how many of those buildings y'all were just talking about that we could convert into real permanent affordable housing, not just for people experiencing homelessness, but for lower wage workers. So I think, really thinking outside the box, putting some, not just relying on the federal money, but putting some state money into it, because I keep hearing, right, that the Vermont economy is a little bit stronger than what people had feared it would be, to make some real changes, right? Like there are people who work in some folks make less, and some people are making like $13 an hour, right? And they're working full time. And of course, you just can't afford a place to live. So, and at least for me, doing a lot of eviction cases, right? I can tell you for so many, I see getting 75% of eviction cases are non-payment. Actually, 70% are nothing but non-payment with nothing else. With people owing very little money. And a lot of time, these are folks who are working, who just had like a bump, they don't have paid family leave, et cetera. Not everybody needs, some folks do need some services to succeed, but a lot of people are just like poor and housing is too expensive here and there aren't enough protections for low wage workers or for people who've already been determined to be too disabled to be able to work for some reason. So just having a variety of different options would be great.
Agreed. And let's see, we're getting close to time. So do we have any other questions or comments? I think that's a great message to close out on.